Good evening, everybody. My name is Soten. I'm a senior student here. With weird fall allergies giving me a postnasal drip in the evenings. The world is weird. When I signed up for this evening's Dharma talk, I had a different plan. The last Dharma talk I gave was on a somewhat uncomfortable topic. I decided to talk about sex and Zen and stuff like that. And it seemed to go okay. So I thought I'd do a little series on difficult topics that we don't talk about very often. And I thought, ooh, let's talk about being in therapy and doing Zen practice. And so that was kind of my, plan. But it just didn't feel like, in the middle of the way things are at the moment, it seemed like, oh, maybe I'll save that for later. There are a long series of difficult topics I could choose to talk about. But in the moment, I felt like talking about this stuff. Some of it, I'm not entirely sure whether I haven't actually spoken about the second half. Let me back up. I have often over the years talked about something called complexity theory. Several people in the room have probably heard too much of that or online. I wrote this book last year on the topic. I have it up here with me because I'm going to read a paragraph from it a little bit later. I keep returning to it because when I first started talking about it, the first time I ever gave a public talk on complexity theory, it was actually at the Village Zendo, because the complexity theory science had led me to principles of Buddhist metaphysics, surprisingly, and so I tried it out at the Village Zendo. That was like 20 years ago, and I've kind of made a career of it ever since. But I try out new stuff often here, and I keep returning to it maybe every 3 or 4 Dharma talks, because there's always some new nuance given current circumstances where it seems to be of value to me. And if it seems of value to me, then I think I should share it in case it's of value to other people. The version of this the intro is the basic intro many of you have already heard or even read about. But I've been called to speak about things in different terms than I have before, because in the last 6, 7, 8 months, because of the publication of the book and the stuff getting out to a wider non-science, non-Buddhist series of communities, I've been giving talks to audiences, online things, seminars, conferences on climate change and sustainability, which gives a very different sort of intensity and import to what I have to say, and has led me to some stuff that I never thought of as part of this, but now feels this week particularly relevant beyond issues of climate change and sustainability. If I'm repeating myself, forgive me. So when I talk about complexity theory, definitely this is repetition for some of you. What I'm talking about is a theory of how the universe organizes itself. And I think of it as one of the 3 great theories, scientific theories of the 20th century. We have quantum physics and relativity, theory of relativity, on opposite ends of the size spectrum. And most people think, oh, those are the 2 big science theories of the 20th century, and that's true. The thing about them both is that quantum physics, on the one hand, describing the utterly tiny infinitesimal size scale of things, is completely non-intuitive in terms of the everyday. Whereas on the other hand, relativity, which concerns itself with gravity and the largest scale of things, is also profoundly non-intuitive. What complexity does is it sort of bridges those two things. And the nice thing about it is it's profoundly intuitive. When I offer this stuff to people, they sort of get it pretty quickly. It's fairly straightforward. Even though it's science, it's actually just sort of readily apprehendable because it's the world we live in. And it concerns itself primarily with how life happens in the universe, how life arises, how life adapts and evolves and changes, how living things die, and how how groups of interacting living things will self-organize themselves into larger scale groups of living things. So for example, we can talk about, this is how I got into it in the first place, I do some stem cell biology research on the one hand, and that's what led me into complexity. You can look at how cells interact with each other, and out of those local interactions, without any cell or anybody planning it, you get tissues like your heart, your organ, or fetal development, or growth from being a baby through teenagehood, adulthood, and eventually dying. All of that stuff is considered by complexity theory. But people themselves interact with each other and self-organize, and we can organize into neighborhoods, we can organize into cities, into economies, into cultures, into civilizations. And all living things, can interact with each other. So you have ants becoming colonies, you have birds becoming flocks. You have a multitude of beings interacting to create an ecosystem. And you have all living things on Earth coming together to create the entire ecosystem of the living planet. And complexity theory describes these things through four very simple principles that apply regardless of how big the things are or how small they are, or whether they're cells or ants or people, etc., or Buddhists. Those four principles that I talk about, I'm not going to go into all of them in detail, but some of them are relevant to me at the moment. The first one is that, this isn't particularly important, but we'll get it out of the way quickly. If you think about an ant colony, it's a very good example. Everyone knows a little bit about ants. We've been seeing them since we were kids. And they're kind of adorable and interesting and cute, and they plague our parents if they want to have a, ant-free house. So if you have 25 ants, that's enough to create a colony that has food lines, digs tunnels, and has a cemetery to place the bodies of ants when they die. And all of that just comes out. There's no ant directing all of that. The ant colony that you get from online, if you order a little ant farm, there's no queen ant in there. It's just a bunch of worker ants self-organizing. The queen ant serves a reproductive function. She's actually the most limited of all the ants in the colony. And if you have 250 ants, you get more complex systems. You can start to have fungal farms, or have a war between neighboring colonies, or larger scale structures, etc. So the more ants you have, the more complexity, and the more diversity of interactions at the local level between ants, the more diversity. And if you have 25,000 ants, vastly more complexity. In human terms, you would say that a village is not a city, is not a megalopolis. But it's the same principles, it's the same mathematics that describes all this stuff. So that's principle number one, or rule number one, as I call it sometimes. Number two, what's number two? I think I'm skipping number two. You're right, this is small. I usually know what number two is. Oh, negative and positive feedback loops. So ants interact with each other by inhibiting their behavior or promoting their behavior. And in general, you want to have an overabundance of things that are inhibiting activities, because you don't want anything to sort of explode out of scale. The way an air conditioner will keep a room in a comfortable range of temperature. But on occasion, you can have something where like your temperature starts to go up, and the higher it goes, and you're getting a fever because you've got an infection. And that serves a purpose for the living organism, because that will drive up the metabolic activity, that increases the functioning of the immune system, and it will help eliminate the infection. But then once the infection is gone, you need to sort of close back down that fever and bring things into the normal oscillating healthy range of your normal body temperature. And that oscillation, the way an air conditioner cooling a room oscillates, that's a hallmark of all living things. Living things are not a flat line. Dead things are flat. Living things are oscillating in a healthy sort of zone. The third thing is that all interactions are local. As I said, there's no ant in the colony particularly watching out for what's going on and organizing where things go. When we're talking about human systems, we usually think in hierarchies. Humans and maybe some other primates are the only creatures that actually think and describe and interact with things as though there's a hierarchy. But the fact is, you could take anything that's built with a hierarchy, like let's say the President of the United States and all their minions coming down to the general population. You can see it with a top and a bottom. But in fact, you can spread the whole thing out, and it's just one web of interactions. And maybe what we think of as the top has more connections to other nodes, to other individuals. But in fact, they're all on the same playing field. All interactions are local. Even if you're running a company, the emails that come in are local interactions between you and whoever sent the email, right? There's no clock up here. Always good to give me a clock. Thank you so much. Oh, yay. Okay, we're doing okay. Yeah. See, you might interpret that as, well, the senior student giving a Dharma talk just ordered the person over there to, But in fact, this was a local interaction based already on established relationships that are happening at the local level. And I might be an asshole and pretend, act like, I'm the top of a hierarchy, but that would be my mistake, not anybody else's. And one of the things about that is that no matter how well connected everything is, everything isn't connected to everything intimately, directly, all the time. So in human terms, I actually have a page in the book where I talk about how, because of that inability to connect with everything, there's always going to be something you're not paying attention to. Humans in government systems, whether it's a company or a school or a country, think that they actually have their fingers on every pulse, but they never do. It's always a little bit incomplete. And that's where the revolutions take place. I have a paragraph in the book where I say this is, a limiting factor of totalitarian or authoritarian states. They always fall because they can't be, in fact, totalitarian. They can't take in every detail of the whole. And the parts where they miss, well, that's the part that gets out from under their control. It was translated into Chinese, and I thought they would censor that paragraph, but instead they translated the word authoritarian as dictator, because in China, dictators are bad, but authoritarians are good. They make that distinction, so it got through subtly. The fourth principle or rule is the one that interests me most, and it's the one that sort of attracted my attention in the first place. It's that inherently there's always going to be some low-level unpredictability in any complex system, low-level randomness. So think about a food line of ants. It always looks like a straight line. And going from the sugar cube over here to the colony there, back and forth until the sugar cube is brought entirely into the colony. But if you bend down and look closely, you see there's always 3 to 4% of the ants that aren't following the line. And it turns out that those ants are the ants that, when the sugar cube runs out, they're the ones who have been off probably locating the next food source. Or if you put your foot down in the middle of the food line, it's those ants that are actually going to find the most efficient route around your foot. It's not the ants in the line that do that. It's the divergent ants. Now, more divergent ants, the better? Well, no, if you have too many, then there's no food line and you just get complete disorder. Too little randomness in the system, just the food line, then when the food source runs out, when the environment changes in any way, there aren't any ants that are prepared to find a new way of the colony organizing itself in response. So too much randomness, disorder; too little randomness, you've got rigidity like a machine. And if the environment changes, you can't change to meet the response and the colony will collapse. So you need this low-level unpredictability in the system. This leads to an interesting idea, and I'm not sure I've talked about this part in the Zendo context before. A teacher of mine, one of the founders of complexity theory and the one who's probably done the most work in applying it to biological systems, is named Stuart Kaufman. And he talks about how, because of this low-level randomness in the system, around each present moment, there's an array of what he calls the adjacent possibles. It's not an infinite array, because the randomness is constrained. It's within a narrow range. But it's also not determinable. You can't say what the range of adjacent possibles is. And an example he gives of this is a screwdriver. What are the adjacent possibles of the utility of a screwdriver? Can you name them all? Make an exhaustive list. Well, you can use it to screw screws in or unscrew them. That's two. You can use it to pry off a paint can lid. You can use it to stop a door. You could use it to ward off someone who's trying to mug you. You could use it like a stabbing tool. You could sort of use it to hold something up while you're putting something underneath it. He uses the example of an engine block, but I don't know what an engine block is. I don't have a driver's license. I know it has something to do with a car or a truck or something. And on and on. All of you could probably think of ways you could use a screwdriver. But it's not an infinite number of things. It's constrained. And so you have this cloud of possibilities around every present moment. And in the next moment, one of those becomes the actual moment. You can't know which one it's going to be in advance. And this is partly why the universe, why living things, despite our culture's tendency to want to call them all machines, the universe is a clockwork. And if you knew every single thing that's happening in the universe at any moment, you could predict what the next moment would be. That's not true because of this limited randomness. So the world isn't a machine. It isn't predictable. The next moment, you can know what the possibilities are, but you can't predict what the actual moment will be. And as soon as the next moment appears, there's a new cloud of adjacent possibles that will then keep propagating into the future. This is one way of thinking about what we mean by karmic law. Karma doesn't mean good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. It means that what happens next is dependent on prior causes. The prior causes are the state of that cloud of adjacent possibles. Another implication of that low-level randomness is, as I said, you can think of complexity theory as describing a kind of order in the universe, the kind of order that creates living systems, where life arises. So one way to think about this is you have three easily identifiable kinds of order in the world. There's perfect rigid order like atoms in a crystal, or billiard balls on a billiard table. Total disorder like molecules in a gas. And then what's called chaotic order, or chaos theory, governed by fractal geometries. And even if you don't know the details of that, you've probably seen fractals. The terms are prevalent enough in our culture that it's something other than perfect order and perfect disorder. Complexity lies at the boundary between chaotic systems and perfect order. And so you might think that mathematically, if you wanted to mathematically plot the state of an ant colony or the state of my body in that zone, you could put it, tag it pin it to a specific spot. But because of the low-level randomness in the system, you can't pin it like that. It moves around in that zone. And given enough time, that random path will lead out of that zone of complexity and either into chaos or rigid order, and the system will collapse. You'll have a mass extinction event. So the thing that makes us capable of adaptation, of actually being alive, necessitates death, either partially or in whole. And this is one way of thinking of Buddhist concepts of impermanence, right? All living things pass, and the universe containing living things passes. Another aspect of this that sort of comes into play is that if you're walking along the desert floor and you see a dark shape on the ground ahead, you wonder, what's that thing? It might even be moving a little bit, but you're sort of like, what's that? There's this dark thing on the floor. And then you walk up closer and you realize, oh, it's not a thing at all, it's an ant colony. And you get in close enough, you see the ants. And the thing that looked like a thing up close is just a phenomenon arising from the interactions of the ants themselves. Well, in the same way, if you go in close enough to the ants, the ant body disappears into a collection of cells that are interacting with each other. So whether something appears to be a thing or a phenomenon of interacting smaller things depends on how close you get in, what's your scale of observation. So, this happened to me once. I was visiting my husband and I, Mark. It was his 50th birthday, and we went to Rome for his birthday. We were visiting friends there, and we were walking towards the Vatican one evening, our first evening there, and I heard this sound. And I just had to look up and see what the thing was. And the first thing I saw was this shape in the sky that looked sort of like some weird spaceship or balloon. And then in an instant, I realized it's a flock of starlings. In the same way, if you go in close enough, the thing that looked like a starling is actually just a flock of cells. And et cetera, et cetera. Is a cell a thing? No, it's just molecules interacting. Et cetera, et cetera. So this is one way of understanding the Buddhist concept of the inherent, the emptiness of inherent existence. Everything in the universe either looks like a thing or looks like a process. And it all depends on which level of scale. And it's like that thing where you have two faces in profile looking at each other, and the space between them looks like a vase. Is it the faces or is it a vase? If you look at the faces, you miss the vase. If you look at the vase, you miss the faces. And neither of those are preferred. It's 50-50. Am I a thing or am I a collection of cells, a community of cells interacting with each other? 50-50. There's no preferred way of viewing this. And so this is what we mean in part by emptiness of inherent existence. So complexity theory somehow has led to these four essential basic principles of Buddhism: emptiness, impermanence. I didn't discuss interdependence, but that's kind of the fact that everything is individuals interacting at the local level. We're all interdependent with each other. And karma. So suddenly the math turns into something philosophical. And potentially actually spiritual. And so that has implications for me, for how I think about the world I'm in and what my place in the world is. And I wrote about it this way on page 170. Complexity prods me to consider how I can participate in the world around me, rather than simply cower with my head down. My gestures don't have to be large because all effects are local, and one never knows what this butterfly flapping its wings will produce in the larger world. One just has to know that we have opportunities for creating adaptive change in every moment, to cultivate greater interactivity between people, to reinforce homeostatic societal feedback loops, to be courageous in resisting what appear like top-down controls, and to trust that nothing is determined or fixed. Every moment has the random potential to surprise us with new possibilities. And sometimes those possibilities are good. The last time I gave this talk, it was before the election, and the example I used was, well, one day we woke up and President Biden decided not to run, and we had a candidate that we thought was going to win the election, and many of us got excited about that. When I use that as an example, it seemed like a good example. The opposite can happen too. However dire the moment, so every moment has the random potential to surprise us with new possibilities. However dire the moment, life-saving adaptation might just be around the corner and might even arise from something you yourself have helped bring forth. So that's kind of, we're in the home stretch here. That's kind of been my take-home stuff for a long time. But then I found myself talking to climate change activists and people working in sustainability who really, to use the Buddhist phrase, they were practicing with a fire on their heads. And the conversation went further than that. And I found myself talking about, and I don't think I've spoken about this in the group before, but maybe I have, about my grandmother. So my father was born in Germany in 1926. Bad time to be Jewish in Germany. He was sent on something called the Kindertransport in 1939 to go to England. That's how he survived the war. My grandparents chose not to, his elder brother was too old for the Kindertransport. They had the opportunity to send him to Amsterdam, but my grandmother said, no, I can't bear to send my other son away. And as a result, when they were shipped with most of the German Jews to Riga, where most of them would be killed, he went with them to Riga. And as did many of her siblings and her cousins and nieces and nephews, etc. I went back to Riga a few years ago. I went to Riga. No one in my family had ever been there. And it turned out to be surprisingly easy to find out all the details of what happened, like the hour they arrived on the train track, the temperature on the train tracks, the route they walked from the train to their first stop in the ghetto. I found the house they lived in the ghetto. It was just a working class neighborhood, and the buildings are all still there. They just took the wire fence down around it. And after a couple of days there, I actually found where my grandmother was killed. So a lot of the Jews from Germany, as well as the Latvian Jews just before them to clear out the ghetto to make way, it's the standard mass grave sort of thing. And there are literally thousands of people per grave. And I found where her body lies. And when I stood there, I thought, who was she in that moment? Aside from middle of the night, freezing cold, terrified, I thought, wow, she died thinking she made all these mistakes. She never saw my father again. She held on to my uncle, and so who knows what was happening to him. Her husband had disappeared into a local work camp, and now she would die alone. And I think that's who she was at the moment she died. And I thought, and I had this feeling of, oh, I've met my grandmother. I think I know who she is. What she didn't know is that because of the choices she made, she was the only one of her sisters and siblings who didn't lose a child. My father was saved by being sent to England, and had she sent my uncle to Amsterdam, he would have certainly been sent to a death camp. And instead, he was at a work camp in Riga, and that's what gave him the opportunity to survive. And she has something like 16 or 17 grandchildren through that, through my uncle, and several great-grandchildren, and 2 kids, my brother and I, and then my brother had kids. And so she had no idea what she had accomplished. And I think that for people who are practicing in the world with the fire burning on your head, you have to do it not only, as the thing I read in the book in this sort of philosophical sort of way, anything I could do could be the thing that fixes things. But when you look at how her life ended and what her last thoughts were, you have to do it without any hope that you will know the outcome. You have to do it without any expectation that you'll have an understanding of what you contributed or what might have actually followed. You might not be around to see it. Or even if you're around to see what happens, you might not know what contribution of yours was the thing. Some of us dream of being activists and we'll step in and we'll do something dramatic that will make some big change. And that may be what flips one situation into another. But it could just as easily be how you held a door for someone and said good morning. Because that butterfly is flapping its wings in the world, and what's it going to turn into out there? We just can't know. So that's the piece I sort of have added in now, and it seems like after the election, in our community at least, that's an important and urgent part of it. You have to look around and see what can you do in every moment. It's up to us to figure out, what do we do? But you can't know whether you're making the right choice. You can only do your best to make the choice that seems right to you. And you have to do it without any expectation or hope that you'll actually know what the outcomes of that are. But in the larger scheme of things, whatever things are right now, the next moment it could flip to something completely different. And impermanence inevitably will.